And I should have put on there, and sometimes I sleep. Not often, though. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here because I'm one of those geeky persons. When they say, hey, do you want to present for Law Day? I'm like, yeah, Law Day, woo. And then my friends are like, what are you doing? What is that? So that's why I have to be on social media and posting pictures and going, this is awesome. Look at all these kids. Yay. You guys are young adults. You're not kids, but that's all right. In both my roles as a history professor and as the president of the League of Women Voters of Nevada, I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about civic education and engagement. I really believe that we have to do a better job about teaching the foundations of governing systems, and that we have to do a better job of empowering Americans to participate in our representative democracy. Pop quiz, who's registered to vote? All right, glad to see those hands go up. Is everybody aware that we have a primary election coming up? Okay, shoot, good. Because that's starting to worry me. Because I spend a lot of time not just thinking about, are people registered to vote? Do they know how to register to vote? But it worries me when I ask someone, are you registered to vote? And they say yes. And then I say, do you know that we have a primary election coming up? And I get the, what? You mean in November? I'm like, no, the primary election in June. And then I get the blank stare, and then that really worries me. Because it's an important thing that we do in participatory democracy, but oftentimes the political parties, civic leaders don't spend enough time explaining kind of the intricacies of what goes on when voters have the ability to have a say in who gets elected and holding people accountable. As a professor, I teach a lot of survey courses. So I'm over at the community college. I teach U.S. History Survey, I teach Nevada History Survey, I teach Native American History Survey, and I teach Latin American Studies. In those types of fields, we were talking all the way, from United States to Native American to Latin American Studies, it's important to be interdisciplinary. It's important to kind of think outside of the box when you're thinking about even traditional things like the Constitution, but also when you're thinking about who participated, who had a voice, who was able to leave records, in repositories, who was able to have a say when people were elected, who was able to ratify the Constitution. I always think about people who I know were in history. I know they were there. For instance, I know women were in history because we're all here. And if you don't have women in history, we wouldn't be here. But did they have the power to learn how to write? Did they have the power to write documents and have them be preserved in a repository so that we could see them today? Probably not. The same thing for Native Americans, the same thing for new immigrants, the same thing for poor farmers who probably didn't have access to education. And so when I think about historical topics and when I think about historical narratives, I always like to maybe turn things sideways a little bit and think about first kind of the course of how we teach history, and then how history has changed as a discipline since the Civil Rights Movement. If you go back to the origins of history as a profession, you kind of land back at the Greeks. And this was the first time when people would say, I'm a historian. That was their profession. Not that they dabbled in history, not that they were somebody that kept oral traditions, but it would be something you would be paid to do, that you could be a tutor, that you could be a mentor, that you could be a professor. It goes back to the Greeks. And when you look at the Greeks and the way that they looked at history and how they examined topics and how they examined themselves and how they examined the world, they were very focused on documents. They were very focused on writing. And that just kind of got baked into the bread, that that's what you did when you were a historian. That if you wanted to be a historian, you spent lots of time obsessing about primary sources. Primary sources that were written by somebody who participated at the time an event took place. And that was going to be the holy grail, that if you wanted to write a good dissertation, if you wanted to write a good thesis, if you wanted to get published, you had to go out and dig out those primary sources. But over the course of time, you eventually get into the 20th century, and we go through the Civil Rights Movement, and we get a lot more diversity in graduate school. So it's not just, middle class and upper middle class white people. It's a lot more people of color, it's women, it's LGBTQ people who are coming into grad school and they're asking, can I be a historian? Sure, you can be a historian, and we're going to teach you how to do historiography, and we're going to teach you how to do research, and we're going to walk you over and teach you about primary sources. Well, obviously, for those students, they did not see themselves in those primary sources. Now, that they might see themselves being written about by somebody else, but they certainly did not see themselves having written one of those documents. And they said, well, that's BS. I will quote Emma Gonzalez, that's BS. If we're just telling, this slice of history, how are we actually getting the historical narrative correct? How do we know objectively that things are the right way? How do we know that what we do as Americans is the right way to do things? And so they started brainstorming and sitting around in the coffee shop and going out to happy hour and said, well, is there a different way to do history that's more inclusive? So we capture everybody and we get everybody's voices. And they started saying, well, wait a minute, here's my friend who teaches anthropology, and they have theories that they use. And here's evolutionary biology, and here's physics, and here's archaeology. And they're not obsessing about primary source documents. They're using other types of evidence, and they're using other types of theory to discover what the truth is. Maybe we can just go and cherry pick, from them and start pulling that into history. Now today, if you go to graduate school to be a historian, they're going to require you to do a minor in another discipline. So my minor is in anthropology. I wanted to do Native American, I wanted to do Latin America, so my minor needed to be in anthropology. But over the course of the last 10 years, I've started discovering I can use string theory. I've started discovering that I can use evolutionary biology. I discovered that I can use algebra when I'm trying to prove the validity of a historical narrative. When I'm trying to get out there and figure out who else was there beside just the dead white guys who were leaving documents in the repository. That there were other people there. Abigail Adams was there pestering John. We know that. And that's because her letter was preserved in a repository, and we found that. And so when I'm looking at things like the U.S. Constitution, and I'm thinking about concepts like separation of powers, I could go back and I can read what James Madison wrote, and I can read what the other founding fathers wrote. But that's kind of like me saying to me, do I think Americans are awesome? Yeah, I do. Oh, that's great. Okay, we're good. Because the founders obviously thought what they were doing was right. Obviously, they wanted us to think well of them. So were they going to write documents to us in the future to say, yeah, we kind of suck? No, they're not going to say that. They're not going to put it in the record. They might squabble between themselves. But obviously we know that they had doubts. Obviously we know that they had weaknesses. Obviously know that they made mistakes. So how do we find that perspective in history? And then how do we maybe prove that what they did maybe was awesome, but use it using more objective terms rather than just the arguments that they presented or just the documents they left or just the documents they used? So having, in a legal term, laid foundation, I want to talk about separation of powers, and I want to talk about the U.S. Constitution in a different way. I could sit here and I could quote James Madison, not Alexander Hamilton. James Madison, because he should have had a musical written about him, not Alexander Hamilton. I'm still going to go see the musical, but I don't like that guy. But, James Madison, I could sit here and we could just go for an hour quoting James Madison because he was a deep thinker, he was a historian, he was somebody that was willing to say he had weaknesses and that he had blank spots in the arguments that he was making. But instead, what I want to do is I want to examine the Constitution using anthropology and maybe a little bit of physics. And so when I look at something like separation of powers, and say, okay, that was a governing system, that was a mechanism for governing, that our founders, when they were holed up in Philadelphia in a hotel for a summer, they kind of eventually landed on that as being a way that they could run a big government that was really going to be a diverse government, and it needed to be able to run a very diverse country. How did they do that? Did they just, pull out a bag and say, whew, there we go, separation of powers, let's try that out? No, they knew somehow that that would be an option that they could try. They knew somehow that that would be a mechanism that might work, but how did they know that? How did they know that that was a possible thing that would be able to fit us? Well, we can look at England, and we can say, well, maybe they got that from England, and we did model our government based on England. But I would like to say, let's go back a couple thousand years, maybe tens of thousands of years, and look at anthropologists and say to anthropologists, okay, in your research, when you look at human beings, how have we governed ourselves since the time we stood erect in Africa and started walking around? Because obviously we figured out how to do it, that's why we're here today. Obviously we didn't go around killing each other to the point that we, became extinct. Obviously we figured out how to get away from animals, but there had to be a way that we governed ourselves, and maybe we can tap into that primal governing system to be able to justify why the way we do it is right. And so when I look at the way anthropologists write about human civilizations, and they go way back in time, you go back to hunting and gathering groups. And you go back to hunting and gathering groups, and they live in family organizations. Usually it's extended family. And in those extended families, for a long time we used to think, well, that's just, family. That's not government. That's not an economy. That's not the way we do things. Oh, yes, it is. Who's in charge at Thanksgiving? Grandma, right? And we all know it's grandma, right? And that's because that's a governing system in our family. Or it might be your aunt, or it might be grandpa, but there is somebody who's in charge, and we kind of know that's the person in the kitchen that tells people what to do. We have traditions and we have ceremonies that go along with familial organization. So if you look at the way extended families govern themselves, they do have structure. The elders have the most information. The people who are the youngest, the children, have the least power, and they have the least information. And then there's gradations that go from being the least oldest to being an elder. But it goes beyond that. It's pretty sophisticated. If you spend any time with a Native American group, if you spend any time with a Latin American group or an African group that are living in a family organization, you will quickly find out they're using separation of powers and checks and balances. No one person has all the power. Everybody is allocated some power. You have power to make baskets. You have power to be a shaman over women's issues. You have power to be a shaman over the elders. You have hunting knowledge. And everybody has a small slice of power. And then it's your responsibility for checking everybody else. It's your responsibility for keeping an eye on your cousins. It's your responsibility for keeping an eye on your aunt. It's your responsibility for keeping an eye on your spouse. And you make sure that that person is not being a predator. And this is where I would pull in evolutionary biology. So how are human beings able to just figure that out? How did we just kind of naturally say, well, that's kind of the way we should run things because that's going to get the best outcome? If you look at our evolutionary biology as a species, we're different from other species in that we're predator and prey. Almost all other animals, you can say that's a predator or that's prey. Predators tend to be very individualistic. They tend to not care about others in their group. They tend to be more selfish. They need to be more self-oriented. Whereas prey animals tend to live in herds. They tend to be very interested in their children and their relatives and their group, and they want to make sure that the group stays together. So as human beings, we're predators. We can go out and kill other animals, and we directly fight with other species. But we're also prey because we don't run very fast, and we don't see very well, and we don't have claws and fangs. So we had to decide, are we going to be individualistic and we're going to be predators? Or are we going to be more social and are we going to be prey? And what we ended up doing is decided it's actually better for us to be social. But we still have that kind of predatory, individualistic, me inside of us. And so when you look at the way we govern ourselves in family, it's to say we're a social group. We need to take care of our children. We need to make sure that the family is replicating itself. But we also need to keep in check that predatory behavior. So no lying, cheating, stealing, no killing. You can't be greedy and corrupt. And so that becomes part of that governing structure. And you make sure that everybody in the group, you separate your powers, you have your checks and balances, to make sure that everybody is keeping an eye on everybody else. Right? Everybody is keeping an eye on everybody else. So when you look at going from hunting and gathering groups, which is maybe one or two families, and then we start to have climate change so that agriculture is a thing that we can do and our population levels start to rise. Now we start to have maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 family groups. And we're still trying to use the checks and balances, but now people are strangers. And how do you use checks and balances if you're not my cousin or my aunt or my grandma or my grandpa? I'm not sure exactly how to interact with you. And so this is the moment in time we start to see strong men. Well, we'll just put one person in charge. We'll just have somebody that's enlightened that we all trust, and that person will make sure that those familial checks and balances keep operating. That one person will kind of be the policeman that makes sure that we're all taking care of each other. And that works okay unless that person's a jerk. And then if that person's a jerk, then you run into problems, and then what do you do about that person? Well, you can remove that person, but what if the next person's a jerk? And then the next person's a jerk? And so then you start to see the next part of this kind of evolution of governing systems called the rule of law. Okay, let's just put somebody in charge, and then we're going to codify laws that go back to our familial separation of powers. That everybody needs to kind of be checking everybody else. Everybody's got to be on the up and up, and nobody gets to be overly individualistic. And so as long as you have somebody that's an enlightened leader and then you have good codified laws, it seems to work. The problem is always that you're always going to run into when you start to see this evolve over time is size. Every time your society gets a little bit bigger, every time it gets a little bit more diverse, it becomes harder because the people that you're interacting with are more likely to be strangers. And you're more likely to have somebody who's in charge that maybe isn't going to follow the law. That's the problem that we had as colonists with England, correct? So when you're looking at the arguments that were made by the American colonists about England, weren't they saying, hey, we're a family. You guys are treating us unfairly, right? We're British subjects too, and the law should apply to us, and the king is being tyrannical, and we don't feel that in our system of familial relationships that we're being treated fairly. And so we kept making these arguments. We need to be able to participate in the decision-making process. We need to be able to be in Parliament because that's where we can make laws and that's where we can check each other. We need to be able to vote. If there's going to be taxes that are going to pursue some type of imperialistic pursuits, we should have a say, because if not, then we're being excluded and then we're going to be singled out. We're not going to be treated as family. And they kept emphasizing over and over again, we're family, why are you treating us this way? We're supposed to be part of a social group, and yet we are being cut out. And so finally, the way that they decided to exercise a check and balance on Parliament and the king was just to say, adios, we're out of here. If we're not going to be part of the family anymore, and we're not going to have those powers that go along with being part of the family, we're just going to step outside, and then we're going to regroup, and we're going to brand ourselves as Americans. And we'll just be a new family. Okay, so we decide we become independent, that's our protest, we exit. And then we step out and we say, okay, now we're a new nation, we're a new family, we're a new social group. And there's going to be some people who are going to say, you can't be a family if you're this diverse. There is no way. We're so diverse that we all look like strangers to each other, there is no way this is going to fail. And a lot of them got on boats and went back to England. And so we're just going to go to England, it'll work there. Once they're gone, then you have a different argument. So you've got an argument by the anti-federalists who are saying, okay, sure, we can be a family, but it needs to be very small and localized. That's the only way families will work. It'd be very local government. All the powers and the checks and the balances have to be within a very localized group. We need to be able to see each other. And what they're really arguing for is kind of going back to hunting and gathering. I got to be able to see you. I need to be able to know you. You need to be my neighbor. I need to feel like we are really in a family and I can connect with you. And we tried that for a while. Didn't work. Because the nation was too big and too diverse. There was too many family groupings and everybody was like, it was like herding cats. People were going all over the place. And so when you watch the founders going in and they're trying to write the Constitution, that's kind of what they're arguing. That's the arguments that they're having, is on the one hand, we got to be a family. We need to be Americans. There has to be kind of this American identity. And how do you take geography and religion and gender and free status and all these different type of identities that are out there and smush everybody into one family and say, okay, we're all going to get along. Everybody's going to get along, or we're going to turn this country right around. And so they're having to struggle with that. And so, again, my favorite founding father is James Madison, because when I'm reading him, I'm seeing him tapping into kind of the ancient ways that we governed ourselves when we were living in familial organizations, where he's trying to figure out, we got to get everybody into one family, and everybody has to see each other as brother, sister, cousin, aunt, and uncle. How do we do that? And so when you look at the Virginia Plan and the mechanisms that he's putting out there, oftentimes what he's saying and what he's doing is he's trying to say, okay, if we group people and we separate powers and we kind of slice and dice things and we check each other, that will get over the barrier of strangers having to interact with each other, because I will feel like there's an outside mechanism that I can hold you accountable and you can hold me accountable. And then, so we'll put that aside, that's one mechanism that we can use. A second mechanism we can use is rule of law. And so we need to make sure that we actually put into law no lying, cheating, stealing, murdering, all those things you're never allowed to do. And that will be rule of law. And then we're going to need to have some type of a strong man. And then we're going to need to have somebody that's kind of in charge if things start to kind of wobble and go beyond what we can control. But that person needs to be forced to be enlightened. We can't have a strong man that's going to become corrupt. And so when you look at the debates of the Constitution, they spent a lot of time talking about what a president was going to be. Now, Alexander Hamilton said, you're going to have a king. There was others who agreed with him. And they said, no, the history is that kings become corrupt. So we don't want to have that, but we do have to have somebody who can be in charge, who can be the enlightening voice in the room, that can be the person that calms other people down when maybe their things start to kind of fly out of control. And we need to have somebody that can be the head of our family, the head of the family. And so they spent a lot of time talking about what that would look like, but they also spent a lot of time saying, and it needs to be enlightened, even if we have to force that person to be enlightened, by checking their powers. And so when I'm looking at the Constitution, I could spend time quoting James Madison. I could spend time quoting John Locke. I could spend time, talking about the philosophers of the Enlightenment. That's great. It validates, that's one way to validate what they did. It is. It's written documentation. But then I say, well, what if I want to validate it other ways? And so I step back and I say, well, maybe I can validate it through anthropology and archaeology and the oral traditions, which is what I just did. That it does fit in with the way we governed ourselves for thousands of years. And if that governing system lasted for thousands of years, it probably is going to work here because it has durability. But now let's throw in a little bit of physics. If you look at the Constitution, it has a lot of negative space. It says a lot, but then there's a lot of things that are not said. It has negative space. In those negative spaces, as the Constitution is ratified and then rolled out, that's where states have power. So if there's not power that was allocated to the federal government directly, that's where states then stepped into the vacuum and said, okay, then we'll take over that power. And they stepped in to what we would call separation of powers and checks and balances. There was negative space there. They stepped in. And it's one of those things that we innovated, even if it wasn't deliberately put in there and deliberately expected to act that way. So that now we have, the 50 petri dishes. Now we have 50 laboratories of democracy, where states came in and they also took that separation of power and said, okay, we're going to carve out in that negative space in the Constitution the way we want to do things, and unless Congress and the courts tell us to stop, we're going to do it. And oftentimes that's where our amendments are going to start. Oftentimes that's where kind of innovations in how we do criminal justice are going to start.
I just want to ask you one question. How does the Declaration of Independence fit into the Constitution?
I'm going to put a pin in that, and as soon as I'm done, that's the first question that I'll answer, okay? But now, and I'm almost there, I'm going to wrap up with, I'm going to move over into one other space where sometimes we don't spend a lot of time talking about this power as being part of separation of powers and checks and balances, and that's voting. So when you look at the Constitution, what does it say about voting? Does it say anything? What are the parameters of elections and voting? Do you know?
Freedom of speech.
That's part of it, but actual voting, does it say who can vote? Does it say qualifications for voting? Does it say how to run elections? Actually, it doesn't. It just says there's way too much diversity in this room in Philadelphia, and there's no way we're going to come to agreement about who gets to vote and how they're voting. So we're punting that over to the states. Good luck with that. And so if you move from state to state, and I see this a lot because I'm president of the League of Women Voters, people move here from other states, and then they run into the way that we do elections here, and they're like, wait a minute, that's not how they did it in California. That's not how we did it in Colorado. That's not how we did it in New Mexico. And that's because that was a power that was allocated out to the states. You guys figure it out. You figure out who's going to be eligible. You decide how to run your elections. There's just going to be a few parameters. It has to be a republic. You need to be thinking about democracy, those types of things. And now we have amendments that govern elections. But still, in a large measure, the states get to run their elections and they get to decide eligibility for voting. Voting is a way to participate in checks and balances. Voting is part of separation of power. It's an allocation of power to every eligible voter. It's a way for us to check elected officials, to check the systems of government, to check laws that are going to go on the books. And so when I see charts that say separation of powers, and it says, you've got your legislative branch, and you've got the judicial branch, and you've got your executive branch, and then sometimes they'll add in there the states. I always want to get out my Sharpie and go right all over it, and voters. Because voters have the ability to impact every part of government. But it wasn't expressly stated in the Constitution, and it wasn't even really talked about when the Constitution was ratified. Only 1/6 of the American people were eligible to vote to ratify the Constitution, because most voting was tied to being a white man with property. But over time, what we've done, as we've tried to figure out how to make democracy work and how to make sure there's representation and how to make sure that there's accountability, is that we keep, over the course of time, enfranchising people. So that by the time you get to the 1820s, the property requirement had been dropped in most states. And then by the time you get to the 1830s and 1840s, age requirements had been lowered. And as you go through time and we start to get amendments and you're going to have emancipation and black men get the right to vote. And then ladies, we still haven't had the right to vote for 100 years yet. We're getting close.
What about the 3/5 compromise?
So that goes away with the 14th and 15th Amendments. It goes away specifically with the 14th Amendment. But what we do over time is we keep extending out this idea that power should be allocated out to the people too. That we are kind of that negative space check on power. It's not really in the Constitution, but more and more we've become vital to the fact that sometimes the people who are running government don't do it very well. And that sometimes people who are running government really aren't representing the will of the American people. And so we're supposed to step up about every 2 years, and then we're supposed to come in and that's supposed to be a check. What worries me, though, is that when you look at the history of the United States, since about the 1830s, we've had this constant battle about voting rights. We still have constant battles about voting rights. Who's eligible to vote? Are you able to cast a ballot? When can you cast a ballot? Is your ballot going to be counted? Are you going to lose your right to vote if you're convicted of a felony? A lot of court cases right now. Gerrymandering is one of the things that we're talking about. Voter ID is one of the things that we're talking about. To me, that says the people who are in charge are kind of afraid of that check of the American people. And that's one of the reasons that I work with League of Women Voters, because I think it's a really important check on government, and that we need more people exercising that check on government. But I'm going to go beyond kind of the usual things that we talk about when we talk about kind of voter suppression. How many of you are aware in the state of Nevada that come the primary election that it's a closed primary? Oh, see, not as many hands went up. Only a few. Do you know what that means? So in the state of Nevada, and this is not all states, there's wide variety across the states, we're one of only 3 states that have absolute closed primaries. That means if you are registered nonpartisan and you show up to be the part of the checks and the balances and the separation of powers, you will not get to vote for any candidate that has an R or a D next to their name. So if you're registered nonpartisan and maybe there's some Republican candidates you really want to get in there, you don't get to vote for them. Same thing on the Democratic side. In our state, if you want to be able to vote for Republican or Democratic candidates, you have to have your party affiliation aligned with those candidates. I worry about that, and I argue with the parties a lot about that we need voting to be really a part of the checks and the balances and the separation of power, and you are blocking the people from holding you accountable. It worries me more that you don't even know that we have a closed primary, that the parties are not getting that information out to you, that they're just doing voter registration and not really informing you. But you can also look at electoral college as being a problem that we need to maybe talk about, because it does restrict voting in certain ways. Presidential caucuses. And so I just want to close, and then I'll go around and answer questions, that when we're thinking about American history, the American narrative, governing systems, why we do things, think outside of the box sometimes. Don't just say, well, we have documents where the founders said they were awesome and we think they're awesome, because maybe they weren't awesome. That there's different ways that we can validate, or maybe we can say, no, according to physics and anthropology and evolutionary biology, we're doing it wrong. Maybe we should do something different, because we can do things that way. And we need to make sure that we're finding every voice in history so that nobody is being excluded. But then today we're making sure that every voice is being heard and that we're not excluding it. That we make sure that everybody, if they have the ability to be that check on power, to participate in our governing and constitutional system, that they feel empowered and enabled to go ahead and do that. All right, so let's go back to your question with the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is separate from the Constitution in that it had a very different purpose. So the Declaration of Independence has 2 purposes. First and foremost, it tells the British government, puts them on notice, we are leaving but it says it in this way. We are leaving and we have valid arguments for why we're leaving, so we're not traitors, don't hang us. Because they knew that if they failed, they could be considered traitors and that they would be hung for that. And so when you read the very first part of the Declaration of Independence, it's Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers laying out their argument, which they think is very rational and reasonable about why we should leave and that England should let us leave. And they're really saying the king has become tyrannical, he's become a strong man, he's not following rule of law, he's not recognizing us as being part of the family. And then they have complaints about Parliament too that are related to that. Second purpose of the Declaration of Independence is to lay out what we think a good government should be and what we would like to implement if we become independent. And that's important because the founders, when they are looking at the Declaration and they're signing it, realize they can't do all the fighting. Somebody else is going to have to do the fighting to win that war. And so if I say to you, oh, would you fight for the war? I think nothing's going to change for you. She's going to tell me no. She's going to say, why would I do that? If I say to you, your life is going to be so much better, here's a document, it's a contract, this is what you're going to get after the war, she might fight. She might be that Minuteman that's going to, take her musket and go out and fight. And so it's a declaration out to England, but it's also a contract to the American people on what type of government we would have if we win. And so that sets it up for, okay, now we're going to become independent, now we have to decide, how do you create that government that we promised? And then that's where we eventually get to the Constitution. Okay. All right.
Wasn't Alexander Hamilton, because I noticed you kind of got on my man, you left out John Jay. I understand about Hamilton aristocracy, but I'm still trying to get Jeffersonian democracy.
So Jeffersonian democracy, Jefferson considered himself to be a man of the Enlightenment.
A Renaissance man, correct?
Mm-hmm. A scientist.
Charles de Montesquieu.
Yep. And so Jefferson was not as kind of nailed down in his ideology and his view of the world. He's a man that's willing to evolve based on arguments. He's a man willing to evolve based on evidence that's presented to him. For instance, when he becomes president, he says he's all about small government, limited government, kind of rolling back what had happened under George Washington and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And then that turned around and on his own signed the Louisiana Purchase and then expanded the country out. And people said, that doesn't look like small government to me, Mr. President.
Also, the Tripoli Wars, we cannot forget when the
Right.
the war.
And so he's like, trying to nail butter onto the wall. It was whatever that worked for him at the time.
Correct. So when we speak about strong centralized government, isn't that what the Founding Fathers were trying to implement when they had the several conventions? You mentioned the Virginia plan. How about the New Jersey plan? Can you explain that a little bit more as far as the smaller states?
So when you look at the differences between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, again, you're quibbling over kind of small local family type government and then larger government where you have lots of families together and maybe a head and codified law. But the New Jersey plan wasn't the anti-federalist plan. I mean, they still agreed we needed a stronger federal government.
William Patterson.
They were just looking for more equality between the different parts of the family. Because what they were afraid is that your little branch of the family was always going to be voted down on the toppings for the pizza when it came to the larger part of the family.
New Jersey plan, William Patterson, correct?
Yes, yeah. There was a question here.
What is your opinion on mandatory voting?
Mandatory voting?
Yes.
I do not agree. I would not agree with mandatory voting, and I don't think it would ever fit. Americans are too individualistic. Americans do not like to be told what to do, and I'm one of those Americans. But on the other hand, I think that people should be presented with argument for voting. People should have a very easy ability if you are eligible to register to vote. And I think you should have a secure and easy way to vote if you decide that's what you want to do. I mean, there are some people who say, I choose not to vote. That's my vote. I'm just not voting. And that's perfectly fine for me. I mean, with me, that's a decision that's being made. I would be afraid if we did mandatory voting that people would do like students do on a multiple choice test. And they would just pick C all the time because, I don't know, C looks good.
I think it's North Dakota that you don't have to be registered to vote. Do you think more states should make it easier to register to vote, or at least not require a process to register to vote?
So what they do is they do have voter registration. So they will check your eligibility. but they don't have all of the other qualifiers that go along with it. You don't have to declare a party. I'm trying to think of all the other things. They have like at-large voting for a lot of their districts. So they do check your eligibility. Are you a U.S. citizen? Are you at least 18 years of age? I mean, those are the things that are constitutionally required. But then after that, as a voter, you are not being restricted in which type of a ballot you can cast and kind of the districts that you live in. It's much more open. And that it's partly because they have a very small kind of homogeneous population. When you get states that are more diverse is when you see more rules and regulations that get put into place. And then you have to take into consideration the political parties. Because on the one hand, they're a blessing because they help us organize, elections and who's going to run for office and all that. And on the other hand, they like to perpetuate themselves regardless of what voters want. And so I have kind of a love-hate relationship with them. But in some states, like in California, they have what's called the jungle primary. In their primaries, everybody's just on one ballot. So they're not divided R and D, you just go in, and then they have ranked choice voting, and so you can say, I like this person first, and that person second, and this person third. In some cases, you get 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats. But then that way you can do issue voting kind of a la carte. So let's say, because I know a lot of younger people who register nonpartisan, it's because they're issue voters. They might be for free college, and they might be for the environment, and they want greater immigration rights. And so they're shopping candidates and saying, what do you think, and what do you think, and they're just, okay, this candidate and that candidate. But what happens in our state, if let's say you have 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats, when you go to vote in the primary, you got to pick one party or the other. You're not going to be able to vote for the candidates that align with your position. In California, you can kind of do that buffet voting and say, here are the candidates that align with my 3 or 4 positions. It doesn't matter which party they are there with. I just want candidates that align with my position. And I have a feeling we're going to move closer and closer to that because I know with my students, they're more issue voters than they are like party voters. And there's not a partisanship.
That's kind of where I fit in. I got caught off guard by that closed primary when I first moved here.
Where you registered nonpartisan and then went, wait, where's all the candidates?
Right.
Yeah, that
And
happens.
then when I read the instructions, I found out I couldn't vote for who I wanted to.
And so you get to vote for like the judges and the sheriff and, yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, that appears to be overly restrictive, so the question I had is, how did this state become a closed primary state, and what could we do to change that?
Good question. It became a close primary state because the parties like to pick their voters, and they're the ones that make the law in the legislature, and then they're also the ones that will have the governor who will sign that law. So the parties decided that that's the way it should be, and they put it into state law. So we just need to get somebody to write a different law, but maybe even move just half a step away and do modified open primary, where you can do same-day party affiliation change, or at least be able to pick your ballot, and say, I want to cast an R or a D ballot and not be turned away, or told you can just vote for the judges. So you might want to, there's a primary coming up, start asking candidates for our state legislature, so the Senate and the Assembly, would you be willing to sponsor a modified open primary bill? And then make sure those people get through the primary. Because if you guys don't show up to vote for them, the party doesn't want them to get through. But they need to be able to get through. But it's not a constitutional amendment, it would just be statutory law. We just need somebody to sponsor the bill. And then you have to put pressure on the committee chairs to do hearings, and then we all have to show up and give them the stink eye and tell them to please pass that law.
You're speaking about the political action committees, correct?
No, just the political parties,
Not the committee.
not the committees. I'm talking about, and so in the legislature there's committees, so we have like an education committee. They're the ones that get to decide when the bill's going to be heard.
I just want to know, what's your take on the social media with your voting and all this?
Well, social media?
Yeah, what's going on in our country?
So I like social media. I mean, we could go back and say, oh, it's worse, dialogue and civility is worse now than it's ever been, and I have to remind you that Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton because they were feuding in the newspapers. Yeah, it's amplified now because of social media. But I find a lot of good things about social media. I can follow news organizations around the world. And so I get lots of different perspectives on what's happening here, what's happening around the world. All the candidates are on social media. So if you want to know who's running for office, they all have Twitter accounts and Facebook pages, and you can kind of look up and see what their positions are. As a female, I like social media because men can't tell me to shut up and I can be on social media and say what I want. So I do like that. So it gives me a platform that goes beyond normal power structures. But then there's the downside. And there's always kind of downsides when you're out in the public square that people are cyberbullying and there's, violence and threats that happen. But it's not that we didn't ever have those things. They just get amplified. And so it's important if you want to be on social media to know how to make sure that you're not accidentally getting cookies on your computer so that somebody's spying on you. If somebody is bullying and harassing you, know how to block them. Know how to contact Facebook or Twitter if you're having somebody threaten you. You just have to be kind of wise about it. But I like social media.
Thank you.
I have a question on jurisprudence after.
Okay, right behind you.
Right. With gerrymandering being in place in the states, do you believe minorities are being ignored?
Yes. There is a blog, it's called the 538 blog. If you go to the 538 blog and it's spelled out as words, not numbers, and then search for the Gerrymandering podcast. They have 5 podcasts there looking at all different aspects of gerrymandering. There's 3 court cases currently, the Wisconsin case, the Pennsylvania case, and the North Carolina case. But it also looks at the difference between racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering. And the interesting thing when they look at racial gerrymandering, that the Supreme Court's more likely to take a racial gerrymandering case because it's easier to see. It's easier to see racial gerrymandering than it is to see partisan gerrymandering. But when the court was ruling, and we've got cases that we've looked at, and what they've done is they said, okay, you've packed a minority group into just one district, you need to unpack them so that they have more ability to elect people that they would like to elect. And the court naturally said they're probably going to be Democrats, so put them in Democratic districts. And then when the podcast researcher went back and looked, they once again found that, let's say, an African American community kind of got split apart among 3 bigger districts, that white voters would not vote for a black candidate in the primary. And it didn't fix the problem. And so now the court is coming back and saying, okay, we got deeper issues that are going on here that we need to be looking at, because we thought that if we district in a way that would align with partisanship, with party, that would be okay, that black voters would still be able to elect black candidates, and it didn't happen. And so now the courts are having to figure out, is there another formula? Obviously racism is a factor that's coming into play here in ways that we had not expected it to. But the last part of the podcast says this: if you can increase voter turnout, you can get around a lot of issues related to gerrymandering. And we've seen this in the special elections that have been happening recently. So there was a district that had a special election in Wisconsin. It was considered the most gerrymandered district in the United States for the Republican Party. And the Democrat just won because the turnout just went through the roof. And so they're finding more and more problems that we've been litigating, problems that we've been trying to kind of, as academics, have mathematical formulas for. You can get around those problems if you can get voter turnout. Same thing happened in Alabama. If you can get voter turnout up, it can overcome a lot of these other problems that the political parties have put into a place and the courts haven't been able to fix. But I would definitely recommend listening to that podcast because it really goes like some deep dives into some of the court cases. And I mean, it's kind of depressing because there's some points where they're like, I don't know what to do. You know, we thought we had fixed a problem and we didn't. Is there a question over here?
How do you feel about lowering the voting age from 18, like to say 17 or 16?
I know on the League of Women Voters email list that I'm on right now, that's a hot topic everybody's debating. Because we allow people to drive when they're 16. I mean, there's a lot of things that go along with turning 16. You could say, well, are 16-year-olds educated enough? You know, are they really, do they have the ability? Well, you know what? I have friends who are 40 that I think that about. So I don't necessarily think it's age. I think we just need to be clearer, but we also need to make sure that we're providing civics education for everyone. That it's not just workforce training. I mean, these are arguments we have at the community college all the time. Oh, people just need workforce training. I'm like, well, no. Education in the United States is supposed to be connected to civics education and empowering people so that they can, get into that separation of powers and be the check and make sure that we have accountable government. I personally would be fine with 16-year-olds being able to vote, but I would also want to make sure that anybody that wanted to get registered to vote had somewhere to go to ask questions about voting, to make sure, if you're wondering about constitutional principles, that you could get that information.
a follow-up question. Do you believe that, like, requiring a civics class or like a voting registration type of class before you're actually able to register to vote, do you think that would help the problem?
Again, I always have problems with anything that's required, because as soon as you make something required, nobody wants to do it and everybody wants to complain about it. But make sure that it's widely available through either a free class at a community college or a high school, or League of Women Voters. We do meetings every month and we talk about these issues, or it can be the NAACP or La Raza, just to make sure that people know that those organizations are there and where you would go to get that information, so that as soon as you registered, you're told this is where you can go get your questions answered, and then tether you to somebody so that you make sure if you want to vote that you feel empowered to do it.
You spoke of Mr. John Locke and how he spoke about humans being left to their own devices. The same thing as Thomas Hobbes, English and philosophy.
I'm going to be thinking about that one while I answer her question, because that's a big one.
Oh, I was just wondering your take on the electoral college vote. Do you think we should use the popular vote instead of the electoral college vote, or what's your take on it?
So she's asking about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Are you guys familiar with that? Yeah, okay. We just had a gentleman come to my League of Women Voters meeting last month to talk about that. And it's not a constitutional amendment. The amending process is really hard. And if you have an Article 5 constitutional amendment convention, it can be a free-for-all. You cannot control what's going to happen. And so League of Women Voters, we have a position against doing that type of amending process. But what the compact says is it says in the Constitution, powers allocated to the states to decide how to run their elections. Originally under the Electoral College, we were supposed to vote, and then they were supposed to go behind closed doors and then just pick somebody regardless of how we voted. Over the course of time, states have told the electors, you will vote per who we decide in this state should be president, and if not, we can fine you or we can put you in jail. So there's been restrictions put on the Electoral College over time. What the National Popular Vote Compact says is that when enough states that equals 270 Electoral College votes sign on to the compact voluntarily through a law, it will kick in, not until then. I think they've got 13 states and they're right around like 190 votes. Then those states will tell their electors, you have to vote according to who wins the national popular vote. And so what that does is it doesn't amend the Constitution, but it aligns the Electoral College with the national popular vote. And it does so constitutionally. League of Women Voters is looking at probably coming out with a position to support that. That we feel that when people vote and then the person who wins doesn't actually win, that erodes people's trust in democracy and they don't really feel that their vote counted. And we really want people to feel like, if I vote, I'm out there and really exercising that check on government power. Yeah.
As the leader of the
League of Women Voters.
Yes. What's your viewpoint on when presidential candidate Hillary Clinton slammed white women and other women of other minorities for supporting President Donald Trump? What's your view on that?
She's an American citizen with free speech rights, obviously. People can say stuff. But within the feminist movement, within any movement, there's a lot of arguments about things like that. And women have the right to choose in many, many ways. I think a lot of women agreed with her, and obviously a lot of women disagreed with her. But I would never want to tell a candidate not to speak. And so my position is, go ahead and say what you have to say, and then voters, we can decide, you as an individual, decide whether you think that that's a good thing or not.
And then just to follow up with that, do you believe that the Democratic Party, which is supposed to be the champion for women, is putting a negative connotation to other women who do support the opposing viewpoint?
Well, League of Women Voters, we're nonpartisan. So we don't work with either of the political parties. We do issue advocacy, we do a lot of civics education. And so I would leave it up to the parties to decide whether they're on the right side of feminism or not, and would reserve judgment. They can decide what they want to do, and then the chips are going to fall where they may. But what I would want to make sure is that any man or woman who's a voter who agrees or disagrees with that, you should be able to show up at the ballot box and cast a ballot to either affirm or to deny that position. And so I wouldn't tell you how to feel about it. If you were interested in what's the different theories on feminism right now, or what's the debate, I would be willing to sit down with you and show you how you can look at things like intersectionality and how you can look at the different, second wave feminism, different voices that are out there so that you could then weigh the arguments back and forth and then decide for yourself. See, I'm like a politician. I'm like all over the place and not really answering your question. No, but with League of Women Voters, we just want people to vote. We want to make sure that people feel that they can vote and do so in a way that's very empowering for them. Because I really feel like here in Nevada, we have municipal elections with less than 9% turnout. We have primary elections with less than 20% turnout. We have midterm elections, and in the midterms in the state of Nevada, we elect our sheriff, our district attorney, our attorney general, our governor, our secretary of state, our treasurer. Those are people that do really important things on issues that I'm sure are important for you. If you don't vote in the midterm, for 4 years, you've missed out on important criminal justice reforms. I mean, right now, are you guys aware that we had a backlog of rape kits? 8,000 of them. The money that was allocated for that was grant money. It will go away. If more money doesn't come out, they didn't provide more money for more detectives. They didn't provide more money for advocates. We should be talking to the district attorney candidates and the attorney general candidates about those things, because if not, we're going to go right back to the way we were before.
How do you think we can do better at educating and involving people into voting and getting people to come and actually cast a ballot?
So getting more people, one of the things I do is I show up and speak at these events. So anytime somebody asks me to speak, I'm there. But and this, I'm going to kind of go back to the fact I'm a history professor at a community college. We struggle mightily with the argument that community college should just be a vocational school where you get workforce training. And I would argue, and a lot of my colleagues argue, no, that's oftentimes if you're lower income, first generation, new immigrant, that might be the first time you have an opportunity to sit in a class with me or somebody else and ask questions and find out about voting and become empowered. And so to me, there needs to be more formal structures in high school to participate in programs you guys are obviously taking advantage of, but are they available in all the high schools? I mean, do we have enough money for that? Or do you have enough, high quality teachers like you obviously have? And then when people get to the university or the community college, not telling students, just get a certificate, you'll be fine. You just need a job. That's good. We want to make sure that you can, pay your rent and have medical insurance and all that stuff. But if you want the government to be accountable, and if you want people to feel engaged, and you want people to feel like, they can really participate, they need to be able to go to a formal setting and be able to say, I want to take a political science class or a history class, and not feel that there's barriers, that they're not being kind of pushed out and saying, no, just get a job. And so that's, oftentimes when I'm working on education policy, that education needs to be the same, and the opportunities for education need to be the same, regardless of who you are, and your standing, and where you are in our society at any moment. I mean, I sometimes get people in my classes who are in their 70s, who will say, I just was told to get a job, and now I really want to be engaged, and I don't know what I'm doing. And we're there, but you're going to have to pay tuition, and sometimes there's going to be barriers to getting into the class. So I'm all for more public education, paying your teachers better, making sure that there's opportunities in every school, not just the magnet schools here. All right, so let's go back to Locke and Hobbes.
And Montesquieu.
So I have a bias about not using them.
No problem at all. We're only here for the enlightenment and the knowledge. Anything you have.
But here's what the Enlightenment says. If you look at kind of the writings about it, if you look like Immanuel Kant, what is enlightenment? He basically says, think for yourself.
I read that in the Bible.
Yeah, and so I wholly endorse people reading old philosophers and text and all that, but at the end of the day, think for yourself.
Okay. Didn't our founding fathers form those same principles as far as like jurisprudence, like law of nation, things like that? Didn't they form those under those philosophers, having those theories in that time?
But here's what they said. When they sat down to write, they kind of cleared the table for writing the Constitution. They said, as men of the Enlightenment, we can think for ourselves. So put everything on the table. And that was different from in the past, where there was tradition and divine right of kings, and you had to do things in a certain way. So when you're looking at Locke, and you're looking at Hobbes, and you're looking at the Enlightenment, the empowering thing about the Enlightenment is telling people, you can think for yourself. Think outside the box, do things in a different way, but you need to, be able to back it with facts and have an argument and being able to, convince other people, but do things differently.
I understand, like you were saying, you were mentioning earlier, thinking out of the box.
Mhm.
Speaking as far as like jurisprudence concerning with the law of the nations and the first principles of law and government, correct? Isn't that the topic that we're still around?
Well, we're talking about separation of powers, we're talking about governing systems and structures.
Strong centralized government, correct?
Not necessarily, because our federal government is definitely stronger than the Articles of Confederation.
Correct.
But when you look at negative space, things that were not mentioned, that takes away from having just a strong overriding central government, because it allocates power out to those who are willing to take it. Whether it's the states, whether it's individuals, whether it's a police force, there's negative space in that Constitution that allows for innovation and allows for us to go beyond what was considered proper and appropriate at the time the document was written.
Moving away from common law, former British law, and parliamentary that we did back then. That's what we moved away when we got our Declaration of Independence.
Because we wrote things down and we codified laws. But yet we did so in a way that kind of goes back to we're a family and we're going to chop up power as much as we possibly can, and then we're going to allow for individual innovation.
Because if one person was let up, it would be either a king or a monarch, and piracy could involve.
And we didn't want that.
Which is why the president has to also push sanctions on Kim Jong-un.
Well, and we can, if you wanted to talk about, presidential and executive authority, it's gone way beyond what the founders thought it was going to be.
Correct.
And then that's where we can look back and we say, okay, back in time, was there times where you had strongman leaders that were supposed to be checked by their own enlightenment, they were supposed to be checked by the rule of law, and they got beyond those bounds, and what happened? Okay. Well, thank you guys for having me. Good discussion. And I'm going to be standing over there with my legal women voter cards if anybody would like to come get them, and I'm hoping that you'll all vote in the primary.